Assalamu alaikum. We begin with today our topic. We are going to deal with the cultural theorist whose name is Raymond Williams. So he has been mentioned to you before in the introductory lectures. So, in studying Raymond Williams, we begin with the term, which is a slight deviation from the term you are familiar with, that is called historical materialism. What we studied in historical materialism that was associated with Marxism was that all history has been the history of class struggles and that it's associated with economy. All history, all hitherto existing societies have had class struggles. Class, which is associated with economy, in other terms is referred to as historical materialism. Term was coined by Karl Marx. Karl Marx believed in historical materialism. But when culture began to be studied in the same light, having a political undertones, having being associated with power, a new term was coined. This is called cultural materialism. But this coinage was not of Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams was the one who explains the term cultural materialism. The one who coined the term is Marvin Harris. Marvin Harris coins the term cultural materialism. The name of the text in which it was for the first time mentioned by Marvin Harris is named The Rise of Anthropological Theory. So anthropology was already there as a stream of study, but in this is in 1968 that culture was again given a different kind of emphasis than we had before. So in 60s, this emphasis on culture comes in with Marvin Harris' coinage of the term cultural materialism. Later on, Raymond Williams gives a complete explanation of the term with further explication and complication of it. The title of the text, which is much more important for you to remember than The Rise of Anthropological Theory, is where Raymond Williams explains about this cultural materialism. The name of this text is Marxism and Literature. This is where you find for the first time that literature is deeply, closely read. A few texts are read by Raymond Williams, closely read, and what he deals in the close reading with is how Marxism functions in every text. He explicates on how ideology functions in literature, and similarly, how cultural materialism is dealt with in literature. The name of the text is Marxism and Literature. This is around 10 years after the publication or after the first mention of the term cultural materialism by Marvin Harris. This is not important for you. What's important for you is to remember the title and date of this text, Marxism and Literature, 1977. We'll be dealing with the same text. We'll be dealing with these terms and the terms that Raymond Williams coins in this very text. So here we begin. After the formal composition of the term cultural materialism and explication given by Raymond Williams, what do you find in cultural studies as per Raymond Williams is that he by this denotes a system of studying practices, a system of studying practices. So here, Raymond Williams himself becomes the one who will study certain practices as systems, as wholes, which are both these systems are taken from both popular and marginalized cultures. So within each text, you wanted an explanation of how Marxism functions in literature. This is where you will find that in all literatures you will find there are certain characters who depict the popular and other characters who depict the marginalized section of the society. How is their culture depicted through them? Their dress, their language, and last time we dealt with Henrik Ibsen's directions. The drama settings will tell you which class one belongs to, the kind of table she has, the kind of sofa she has in her room, how many rooms she has in the apartment that she lives will tell you. I'm talking about Nora in the doll's house. Dictates what the culture of that popular system is or that marginalized system is. And with this study of popular and marginalized cultures, you also get to study the categorizations of art, which is how high art gets institutionalized. So, high art will be all art associated with the popular culture, and institutionalized high culture, quote unquote high culture, with the objective of relating them to political formations. So, this is exactly what we have been hinting at in the Marxism lectures where we associated it with culture. Here again, in the definition of cultural materialism that you find in Raymond Williams, is that it studies closely the practices that are practiced by popular uh, popular in popular culture and those of the marginalized culture that are not given much importance to. And then how high culture becomes institutionalized. Institutionalized means that it is set up as a system. If we take the example of our own culture, there will be some kind of an art that is given an identity, which is identified and then set in systems of polity or recognition simply. So, what is the system of recognition? Where does the recognition, where does art find recognition? For example, there is not much recognition of certain arts in our system too. Like the art that is now dying, that used to be called Band Pathar. So, how did this art die? Because it was popular not among the high class people, but it was popular among the marginalized sections, the poor people. So this is why it had to die ultimately. The system was not recognized by the polity of the day, and therefore it's dead. Now similarly, talk about Ladisha. It again wasn't given that system of recognition. So you are not required. What's now required is that what you find on YouTube features. Any music with a good videography set on YouTube will get popular significance because this is something poor will not be able to afford. So, since this is afforded by the people of high culture, people of high class, this will be associated with high culture, high art. And that which is not associated with the poor, which is associated with the rich, will ultimately gain a recognition. So, what we have today in our Center for Art and Culture, this will only work in preservation of that art and that culture which is only recognized by the rich. So someday you get to hear that some Bandapurtha is coming up and this will be showcased in some place. Say somebody tries to revive Bandapurtha. Now people spend some money into it and this gets a grandeur that it requires for the popularization, which means it requires money. Once money is invested into it, people try to revive a system. So that money has to come from people who can afford it. So poor only afford their daily bread. They cannot afford investing into something. So once this born pathway is established with high grandeur, Center for Art and Culture will be made to give attention, to pay attention to this art. So what does it first require? For high art to become high art and high culture, it requires, it has a material backing. High art has a material backing. Now, similarly, in the study, we will find a lot that is to be studied. Say, for example, there are the kinds of arts that are considered to be high art, but only high class people will be able to appreciate that art. This is not the art like YouTube featuring. Say, I talk about any modern art. I give you a painting. This modern painting is supposed to be sold, and the painter himself, a modernist painter, sells this for 300 million dollars. Okay, so what's the painting? If you're asked, what's the painting? Uh, who will purchase it for 3 million, and who will set that sum of amount for that art, which the poor or the common people will not even be able to find the aesthetic value of. The aesthetic value of high art is only known by high class people. The aesthetics of high art is also something that is not affordable by everyone in the society. This too, the aesthetics too, has a material backing. If you want me to give you an example of this is, well, you are reading these days, if you have read, and some of you are reading modern art, modern novels. Modern novels is something not everybody purchases. It's only purchased by those who have that access to they have that, you find an aesthetic appeal in modern novels, and that's why you read them. Who will find it aesthetically appealing? It's only people who can afford university education. People who can afford university education will be able to appreciate that art, modern art. So let me show you one image that I said you need to have access to that kind of an education, or that kind of a class for you to appreciate high art. I'll show you an image, and these images were sold for millions of dollars. So I'll show you two images. You have to tell me which one appeals you more. These are the two kinds of paintings that we have. One is on this side, one is this or this one. This is realistic art. This is called realistic art. Images picked up from real everyday life. And on the other hand side, you have something like this. It says comedy, the name of the image. 1921 shows Klee evoking earthly and the somewhere else with a bizarre parade of half recognizable figures. But this is more expensive than this painting. This will cost you only a few hundred and thousand bucks, but this one, millions of dollars. So, appreciation of art, aesthetics, appreciation, judgment of art is also associated with the class you belong to. If you belong to middle or poor classes, you won't be able to appreciate high art. People who are appreciable of high art themselves belong to that culturally rich class, and only that being born in that rich class, they have been familiar with such kind of an art because their parents have bought such kind of paintings when they were kids. They have seen such paintings. They have been This has been explained to them what these paintings mean. They understand the meaning of these paintings. They know what colors are used in it. These paintings require very expensive brushes, very expensive colors, unlike the realistic painting that can be painted from any ordinary color or brush. So this is where they can place a value on that art. So now that we have seen something of some art, similarly goes with modern novels. You afford that university education that you will be able to sometime in future or now. You are able to appreciate that art, and not everybody reads that art. If you give this your modern novel to anybody who is good at reading and tell them start reading this text, they'll tell you they have read millions of texts, but this one doesn't allure them. So why doesn't that allure them? Because it's high art and they cannot aesthetically value it. Let's come back to the definition that we have here and see if you can place it in context. A system of studying practices, both studying practices, which are both popular. These practices are popular. These practices are those also that are marginalized, that are studied in cultural studies. And this belong to popular culture or marginalized culture. And we also study in cultural materialism how they get institutionalized into high culture with the objective of relating them to political formation. That there is always a politics behind high art being considered high art. So, because it's associated with class, we already know how class is important for politics. This has already been done in Marxism. So, this is why Marxism and literature. Is it clear so far? मैं आगे चलूं, आगे की बातें बताऊं. Is it clear so far? Okay, so what do we find? The people who practice this theory, the people who study culture with this vision, with this perspective in their mind, with the system, with this principle underlying, what do they study then? The practitioners of this kind of a theory believe that culture itself is something that perpetrates materiality. Culture perpetrates materiality. So, this is something again you can read in the context of the paintings that was shared with you. Culture is perpetrated through materialism. So, that's why some culture become high art, some culture become obsolete within days because materiality is associated with it. Two examples are YouTube features these days and Bondapather. Why did one die and why can the other die? So, like I also told you about the modern painting, that it requires very very expensive colors and very very expensive canvas, board, painting, experience, reading, education, underlying education is required. Similarly, for creation of that YouTube video, um, which has high reach, also requires something like that. YouTube, I'm talking about YouTube features, something as an art, studied as an art form. It also requires some material backing. You need to have some money, some expensive gadgets to record your videos with, expensive gadgets to record your sound with. Culture perpetuates materiality. And also, the counter perspective of the same is that, and a resistant reading of culture can positively be done. A resistant reading of culture, a resistant reading of culture can positively intervene into the social systems. So we have been talking only about art. We can talk about social systems now and relate it with the politics. Okay. Um, Examples are, let's take wedding ceremonies as an example. So there are two kinds of wedding ceremonies that we can have. One is an extravagant one, and the other is a modest one. Hmm? Again, read it in this context. Culture perpetrates materiality. So, whichever way you go, it will perpetrate materiality. So, this becomes more popular because it has more material backing with it. This is less popular because this has less material backing with it. So, how can we use this kind of a culture? Through the same social formation, through the same social event, wedding ceremonies. One is this event can be made used to perpetuate that culture, and same event can be used to resist the culture, resistant reading of culture that can intervene into the social systems. So this will be its resistance. If this is clear with you, come up with more examples. Tell me a social event, social formation, social system, social institution where we have both kinds of perpetuations. One is perpetuation of materiality, and second is how it can be resisted. Quick, quick. Birthday parties. Okay, explain. How can you resist the same? You have to make use of the same culture and resist it. So you did not get my point.
um, मैम जो चाहरुम हम करते हैं
Okay, yeah. Yes. So, an unavoidable social system can be avoided, or avoidance is something, resistance is something else. So, let's not avoid chaharum, but let's keep it the same way. The two types can be. What do you want to say, Sahiba, about chaharum?
मैम भाई इसमें मटीरियलिटी मतलब हम वो वाजवान वो सब स्किप करके हम बस कुरान ख्वानी वो सब कर सकते हैं तो
Ah, excellent. So, having a material backing is not always necessary. We can make it resistant instead. So people may come for the food. People may come prepared that they are going to be served with seven, nine, or 11 kinds of cuisines. But what they will find is that they will be handed over with a Quran Sharif. Yeah. So this is how the same can be resistance intervening can be done into it. Can I have one more example? What you are doing is that जब मैं आपको कुछ देती हूँ यहाँ से, आप उसी के आगे पीछे कुछ ना कुछ निकाल के देते हो. थोड़ा दूर निकलो. Have a broader perspective of society has a lot of it. Hmm. Yeah. Think. Quick. What all constitutes society? There are so many institutions in society. Clothing is one. Okay. Let's take clothing. Dressing like today's. Okay. Come on, tell me, Darakshan, what do you want to say? We are picking up clothing. Very good. Excellent. So, what is one perpetuation through materiality? One perpetuation through materiality is having expensive clothes. For example, the more your tilla, the more expensive it is. And then again, if it's machine made or handmade, the more expensive it is. Okay, let's take this example to consider high culture. If you are not able to figure out the difference between handmade tilla and machine made tilla, you are something ordinary for the society. And if you are able to figure out the difference between handmade tilla, and this is about any art, any ari work or Sozni work, or what other works do we have? Things, the work done on any shawl. If you're not able to differentiate between machine made work and handmade art, you don't belong to that class, quote unquote class, who can figure the difference out. So the more your tilla and the more it's handmade, the more crafty it becomes. Handmade, the more expensive it is. But how can the same be resisted? Daraksha, how do you think it can be resisted? Where can the resistance be brought in the same perpetuation? Yeah, Daraksha, any ideas? Anybody else who has ideas about how resistance can be brought through clothing itself? Let's begin that resistance. What is it? Yeah. So plain parent is something that will resist it. But this will only be a resistance on a small scale. Like resistance does not come all of a sudden. But this materiality is so natural. It's like the air you breathe in. It doesn't require any efforts. It happens on its own because materiality is behind it. So nobody put efforts to do this. Make your mind filled with this trash that this is expensive, this is not expensive, you can afford it, I cannot afford it. But this requires too many efforts. This requires brains. This requires brains. And this doesn't require brains. Anybody can do this. You just need to have money. We can think on resistance. A lot can be done. Before doing that, let's study what all this is about and then go into the nitty gritty of how we can change our society and our culture. What next he studies in Marxism, Raymond Williams studies in Marxism and Literature, is how any culture is associated with political context of the time. What is the political context of the time that gives rise to any art formation? Let's see what he has to say about this. Raymond Williams says that you can classify cultural forms. You can classify cultural forms into three categories. The first is dominant culture, depending on the degree of political backing culture has. Dominant culture, the second is residual culture, and the third, emergent culture. For you to remember easily the three terms, it's RED read. Though the sequence is not that, that's easy to find out what the sequence is. When you go into the details of each, you will find the sequence very easy to remember. But for quickly remembering the three terms, it's already read: residual, emergent, and dominant. Now, what does he say about these different types of cultural forms? And what is the basis of his classification? How does he distinguish between these three kinds of cultural forms? And what is his categorization based on? His categorization is very central to the study of the same: cultural materialism. Cultural materialism is important for these categorizations. This is also called tripartition of culture. The dominant culture is the one that has the major political backing, and anything that is supported by the state will become the dominant culture. What we have today as the dominant culture in Srinagar is smart city. How smart is it? We can question that. What's the residual culture? The residual culture is the culture that was there before this dominant culture. We still find some residues of it. Some residues of it are still to be found. So the smart city, what is the smart city aim at? The smart city aims that um, the places where they have these SMC bins, these places will be converted into beautiful gardens. They will be converted into beautiful gardens. So what is residual? If you have 100 such sites and 80 have been converted, residual is that there are 20 trash sites still there in Kashmir, in Srinagar. But this will be a geographical example of it. What we do in cultural formations is that we give cultural examples of it. That what the dominant culture is, what the residual culture is. So again, another example of dominant culture is that, have you seen the billboards about these songs that are being featured in Srinagar? You may have, or you may not have. There are big billboards coming up about um, popularizing these songs that are featuring Kashmiri heroes in Srinagar. This is part of the smart city control. But what do we find residual culture is that a lot of people are there who are against it, who are resisting this new influence of culture. Resistance is seen. So, where does this residual population come from? Because they have still the previous ideology that this was wrong and we continue to be with it. Emergent culture is where both will have an effect and a new culture will emerge out of it, where both are uh, in conflict with each other and also in dialogue with each other. So, this is similar to the pattern of Hegel's philosophy, which is there will be a thesis like this one, there will be an antithesis, the second one, and together, when they interact with each other, what will emerge out of it is a synthesis, a new form which neither this knows nor this knows of. Something new will come out of this synthesis. Any questions? In any piece of literature, you also find significant cultural formations that are one dominant, that go with the political background of it, then residual, something, some character is carrying forward the previous dominant culture that was previously dominant. And then out of the two, what you find the ultimate resolution in the literary text is the emergent culture into it. I can give you examples, but not in this lecture. We are still in the beginning. This is an initiation into cultural materialism. Is it clear with you? You can unmute yourself and ask me questions if you have any.